The recording begins with a voice, calm, controlled, almost emotionless, the kind of voice that does not need to shout to create fear, because the words themselves carry enough weight, and as it plays, it becomes clear that this was not meant to comfort, not meant to warn, but to prepare, to explain a reality that no one should ever have to face, a reality that feels distant at first, almost unreal, until you understand that it actually happened. This is the story connected to a man known as the Toy Box Killer, David Parker Ray, a name that would later become associated with one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history, not because of how quickly it happened, but because of how long it remained hidden, how something so severe could exist without being fully seen for years. At first, nothing about him stood out in a way that would immediately raise suspicion. He lived in a small town, surrounded by ordinary routines, familiar faces, and a life that, from the outside, appeared quiet, controlled, even predictable, the kind of environment where people assume they understand what is happening around them, where danger is not expected to exist so close. But behind that ordinary surface, something else was taking shape, something carefully constructed, something planned over time, not in a sudden moment but gradually, step by step, hidden from view, built in a way that allowed it to remain unnoticed. There was a place, isolated, private, not visible to others, a space that would later become central to the investigation, a location that had been prepared in advance, not randomly, not without intention, but with a level of control that suggested long-term planning. For those who would later learn about it, the most disturbing part was not only what existed there, but the fact that it had existed for so long without being discovered, raising questions about how something like this could remain hidden, how close it was to everyday life, and how easily it could be overlooked. The case began to surface not because everything was suddenly revealed, but because something went wrong, a moment that broke the pattern, a moment where control slipped just enough to expose what had been kept hidden, and it was through that break that authorities were finally led to uncover what had been happening. When investigators became involved, the situation quickly shifted from uncertainty to something far more serious, because the evidence they began to find did not point to a single incident, but to a pattern, something repeated, something structured, something that suggested this was not an isolated event. The more they looked, the more it became clear that this case was different, not only because of what was discovered, but because of the way it had been organized, the level of preparation, the way everything had been kept out of sight, creating a situation where the reality of what had happened was far more complex than it first appeared. There were recordings, materials, and details that indicated planning, not impulsive action but something deliberate, something that had been developed over time, and this shifted the understanding of the case from something sudden to something that had existed beneath the surface for much longer. For investigators, this created a different kind of challenge because they were not only trying to understand what had happened, but how long it had been happening, how many incidents were connected, and how much of it had gone completely unnoticed. As information continued to emerge, the case began to draw wider attention, not only because of its severity, but because of the questions it raised about visibility, about how certain realities can exist without being seen, about how something can be present and yet remain hidden within what appears to be an ordinary life. And this is what made the case so unsettling, not only the actions themselves, but the contrast between what was visible and what was concealed, the difference between the ordinary image presented to the outside world and the reality that existed behind it. Because in situations like this, the most disturbing part is not always the moment when everything is revealed, but the realization that it had been there all along, close enough to be part of everyday life, yet hidden in a way that made it almost impossible to detect until it was too late. And as the investigation moved forward, it became clear that this was only the beginning, because what had been uncovered was not the full story, but just the first layer of something much deeper, something that would continue to unfold in ways that would challenge even those who were experienced in dealing with cases of this nature. As the investigation deepened, what had first appeared as a disturbing but isolated discovery began to reveal a structure that was far more calculated, because the evidence suggested not randomness, not a single moment of loss of control, but a system, something built over time, something that required planning, patience, and the ability to remain unnoticed while everything continued on the surface as if nothing was wrong. Investigators returned to the location again and again, each time uncovering details that added to the overall picture, not all at once but gradually, piece by piece, because what they were dealing with was not something simple that could be understood in a single moment. It required careful examination, careful reconstruction, and an understanding that every small detail could connect to something larger. The environment itself became a key part of the case, not just as a place but as a reflection of intention, because it was not random, it was arranged, organized in a way that suggested control, a space that had been prepared in advance rather than used spontaneously, and this shifted the investigation from asking what happened to asking how long it had been happening. There were signs that pointed to repetition, to patterns that extended beyond a single incident, and this created a growing concern among investigators, because it meant that what they were uncovering might represent only a portion of a much larger reality, one that had remained hidden for far longer than anyone initially expected. At the same time, they began working to identify possible victims, to connect missing person reports, to examine timelines that might align with what they were discovering, and this process was not immediate, because not every detail fit perfectly, not every case could be directly linked, and yet the possibility remained that there were connections that had not yet been fully recognized. The recordings that were found became an important part of understanding the case, not because they provided simple answers, but because they revealed intent, a mindset, a way of thinking that helped explain how something like this could exist for so long without interruption, and this added a psychological dimension to the investigation that went beyond physical evidence. For investigators, this raised difficult questions, not only about actions but about awareness, about whether there were moments when something could have been noticed, something that might have prevented the situation from continuing, and whether those moments had simply passed without recognition. As more information surfaced, it became clear that this case involved more than one individual, and this added another layer of complexity because it introduced the question of involvement, of how multiple people could be connected to the same situation, whether through direct participation, knowledge, or influence, and how those roles contributed to what had taken place. The timeline continued to expand as new details were examined, stretching further back than initially expected, suggesting that what had been discovered was not recent, but part of a longer sequence of events, and this realization changed the scale of the investigation, because it meant that the impact of the case could be broader than originally believed. Despite the growing amount of information, there were still gaps, still moments that could not be fully explained, transitions that were not clearly documented, and this is often what makes cases like this so difficult to fully resolve, because even with extensive investigation, not every piece can be placed with certainty. At the same time, authorities work to separate confirmed evidence from assumption, because in cases that attract attention, it becomes easy for speculation to grow, and maintaining a clear line between what is known and what is believed is essential to reaching accurate conclusions. The case also began to draw attention beyond the immediate area, as reports reached wider audiences, and with that attention came increased scrutiny, more questions, and a deeper interest in understanding how something of this nature could remain hidden within an environment that appeared, on the surface, to be ordinary. For those involved in the investigation, the challenge was not only to uncover what had happened, but to ensure that the information gathered could be used to build a clear and accurate account, one that could stand on evidence rather than interpretation, even if that meant accepting that some aspects would remain uncertain. And as this process continued, it became clear that what had been discovered was only part of a much larger picture, a picture that would take time to fully understand, because each new detail did not simplify the case, but expanded it, revealing connections, possibilities, and questions that extended far beyond the initial discovery. This was no longer just an investigation into a single event, it had become an effort to understand a pattern, a structure, something that had developed over time and remained hidden until a single moment allowed it to be seen, and even then only partially, leaving investigators with the difficult task of uncovering the rest. And with each step forward, one thing became more certain, that the reality of what had happened was far more complex than anyone had first imagined, and that understanding it would require not only evidence, but time, patience, and the willingness to follow every detail, no matter how small, because in cases like this, it is often the smallest details that reveal the most. As the investigation continued to unfold, the case began to shift from discovery to reconstruction, because by this point, investigators were no longer asking only what had been found, but how everything connected, how each piece of evidence fit into a larger sequence of events that had developed over time. The focus turned toward building a timeline, not a simple one, but a detailed reconstruction that could explain movement, interaction, and progression, because understanding when things happen was just as important as understanding what happened, and in cases involving long-term patterns, time itself becomes one of the most critical elements. They examined records, cross-referenced information, and compared details that might at first seem unrelated, looking for consistency, looking for patterns that could confirm or challenge what they had already discovered. And while some connections became clearer, others remained uncertain, creating a balance between what could be established and what could only be suggested. At the same time, interviews became a central part of the process, not only with individuals directly connected to the case, but with those who may have had indirect knowledge, because sometimes understanding the environment around a situation can provide insight into how it was able to exist without being fully recognized. These conversations revealed fragments of information, not always complete, not always immediately clear, but enough to add context, enough to show that what had taken place was not entirely isolated from the outside world, even if it had remained largely hidden. The role of those connected to the case became increasingly important, because understanding involvement, awareness, and influence required careful evaluation, and this added another layer of complexity as investigators worked to determine not only actions, but responsibilities, and how those responsibilities contributed to the overall situation. Meanwhile, the psychological aspect of the case continued to be examined, because beyond physical evidence, there was a need to understand behavior, to understand how patterns are formed, how control is maintained, and how certain actions can be repeated over time without interruption. And while this does not provide simple answers, it offers a framework for understanding how such cases develop. Forensic analysis also continued, focusing on confirming details, verifying findings, and ensuring that every conclusion was supported by evidence, because in cases of this nature accuracy is essential, and every claim must be grounded in something that can be demonstrated and verified. Despite these efforts, there were still limitations because not every event had been recorded, not every moment had been observed, and this meant that certain parts of the timeline would always contain gaps, areas where the exact sequence could not be fully reconstructed, and this is often where uncertainty remains. The challenge for investigators was to build the most complete and accurate account possible within those limitations, to present a version of events that was supported by evidence, even if it could not answer every question in absolute detail. As more information became organized, the case began to take on a clearer structure, not because it became simple, but because the connections between events, locations, and individuals became more defined, allowing investigators to see how different elements interacted and influenced one another. At the same time, the broader impact of the case became more visible, not only in terms of the investigation itself, but in how it affected the community, how it changed perceptions, and how it highlighted the importance of awareness, of recognizing that not all situations are as they appear on the surface. The case also served as a reminder of how complex human behavior can be, how actions can be concealed, how patterns can develop over time, and how understanding those patterns requires more than observation. It requires careful analysis, patience, and a willingness to look beyond what is immediately visible. And as the investigation moved closer to its later stages, it became clear that while many details had been uncovered, the process of understanding would continue, because each conclusion opened the door to further questions, and each answer revealed additional layers that required examination. This is what defines cases of this nature, not just the events themselves, but the depth of analysis required to understand them, the effort needed to piece together information that was never meant to be obvious, and the recognition that even with extensive investigation, some aspects may remain unclear. And yet, within that uncertainty, there is still progress because every piece of verified information contributes to a clearer picture, even if that picture is not perfect, even if it contains gaps, because in the end, the goal is not perfection, but truth as close as it can be understood. As the investigation moved into its final phase, the focus shifted from uncovering new details to forming conclusions, because by this point, investigators had gathered as much evidence as possible, examined the environment, reviewed timelines, and evaluated the roles of those involved. And now the challenge was to bring all of that together into a clear and legally supported understanding of what had taken place. The findings were not based on a single piece of evidence, but on a combination of factors: physical discoveries, recorded materials, testimonies, and patterns that had been identified throughout the investigation, each contributing to a broader picture that could explain not only individual events, but the structure that allowed those events to occur over time. Legal proceedings became the next step, because once the investigation reached a point where sufficient evidence had been established, the case moved into a system where responsibility had to be determined, where actions had to be evaluated under the law, and where outcomes would be decided based on what could be proven in court. During this stage, the complexity of the case remained evident, because while some aspects were supported by clear evidence, others required careful interpretation. And this balance between certainty and uncertainty is common in cases that involve extended timelines and multiple elements. Testimonies played an important role, not only in confirming specific details, but in providing context, helping to explain how certain actions may have occurred, how relationships between individuals influenced events, and how the overall situation developed over time. At the same time, the legal process required a clear distinction between what could be confirmed and what could not, because in a courtroom, conclusions must be supported by evidence that meets specific standards, and this meant that some aspects of the case, while discussed, could not be treated as definitive if they lacked sufficient proof. The outcome of the case reflected this approach, focusing on what could be established with certainty, assigning responsibility where evidence supported it, and recognizing that while not every detail could be fully explained, the core elements of the case were clear enough to reach a conclusion within the legal framework. For many, however, the conclusion did not remove all questions, because while the legal process addresses accountability, it does not always provide a complete narrative that answers every aspect of a case, especially when certain moments remain unobserved or cannot be reconstructed with full accuracy. This difference between legal resolution and personal understanding is what often leaves a lasting impact, because people naturally seek complete explanations, and when parts of a story remain uncertain, those parts continue to draw attention and reflection. The case also highlighted the importance of awareness and prevention, because understanding how such situations develop can contribute to identifying warning signs, recognizing patterns, and addressing concerns before they evolve into more serious outcomes. And while not every case can be prevented, increased awareness can reduce the likelihood of similar situations occurring. At the same time, it is important to approach such cases with accuracy and responsibility, because while they may be discussed widely, they involve real individuals, real events, and real consequences, and maintaining a focus on verified information ensures that the case is understood in a way that respects both the facts and those affected by them. As the investigation and legal process concluded, the case became part of a broader discussion about how complex situations are handled, how evidence is interpreted, and how conclusions are reached when not every detail is fully known, and this discussion continues to shape how similar cases are approached in the future. And while the final outcome provided a form of closure within the legal system, it also left behind a reminder that even when a case reaches its official end, the process of understanding it can continue, because each case contributes to a larger effort to improve awareness, improve response, and improve the ability to recognize and address situations before they reach such a level of severity. In this way, the case does not simply end, it becomes part of an ongoing effort to learn, to understand, and to ensure that the knowledge gained from it can be applied in ways that make a difference beyond the events themselves. As the case reached its final stage and the legal process came to an end, what remained was not only a conclusion, but a deeper reflection on how something like this could exist for so long without being fully recognized, because beyond the evidence, beyond the findings, there was a larger question about awareness, about how certain patterns can develop quietly, unnoticed, within environments that appear ordinary on the surface. The story did not end with the courtroom because while responsibility had been assigned and the investigation had been completed, the impact of the case continued, not only in the lives directly affected, but in the broader understanding of how complex and hidden certain realities can be, and how easily they can remain outside of everyday attention until something forces them into view. For those who studied the case, it became an example of how important it is to look beyond appearances, to recognize that what is visible does not always represent the full reality, and that understanding requires attention to detail, awareness of patterns, and the willingness to question what might otherwise seem normal. At the same time, the case also demonstrated the limits of what can be fully understood, because even with extensive investigation, even with careful analysis, not every moment can be reconstructed with complete certainty, and this means that some aspects will remain unclear, not because they were ignored, but because they were never fully visible in the first place. This balance between what is known and what remains uncertain is part of what gives such cases their lasting impact, because they exist not only as events that have been documented, but as situations that continue to be examined, discussed, and reflected upon, each time offering a different perspective, each time raising new questions about how and why they occurred. The case also became a reminder of the importance of responsible storytelling, because when events are shared widely, there is a responsibility to present them accurately, to distinguish between fact and speculation, and to ensure that the focus remains on what can be supported by evidence rather than what is assumed or imagined. For viewers and listeners, it is easy to become drawn into the mystery, to focus on the unknown, to search for explanations that fill in the gaps, but it is equally important to recognize that behind every case are real people, real experiences, and real consequences that extend far beyond the narrative itself. And this is where the story shifts from being only about events to being about understanding, about learning from what has been revealed, about recognizing patterns that may appear in other situations, and about using that awareness to approach the world with a deeper sense of attention and responsibility. Because while cases like this may feel distant, they are built from real circumstances, and those circumstances often begin in ways that are not immediately obvious, making awareness one of the most important tools in recognizing and addressing them before they develop further. As time moves forward, the details of the case remain documented, available for those who choose to study them, and while perspectives may differ, the core of the story remains unchanged, a reminder of how complex human behavior can be, how hidden patterns can exist, and how understanding those patterns requires more than surface-level observation. And in the end, what remains is not only the outcome of the case, but the understanding it leaves behind, an understanding that extends beyond a single event, into a broader awareness of how important it is to pay attention, to question, and to recognize that not everything is as simple as it may first appear. Because sometimes, the most important part of a story is not just what happened, but what it teaches, and how that understanding can shape the way we see the world around us, long after the case itself has reached its official conclusion.